The era of uncontested American maritime supremacy ended this morning not with a whimper, but with a calculated bureaucratic announcement from Tehran. The Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps has declared a policy of reciprocal security measures targeting United States bound commercial shipping in the Strait of Hormuz. Let's be absolutely clear about what this means, because the people currently inhabiting the White House and the State Department certainly do not understand it. The party is over. For decades, we have operated under the delusion that we could sanction nations into poverty, seize their assets, and dictate the flow of global energy, while our own commercial interests remained untouchable, protected by a veil of supposed deterrence that evaporated years ago. What we are witnessing right now is not merely a provocation, it is a fundamental shift in the strategic architecture of the Middle East. And it is a shift that the United States Navy is neither designed nor equipped to counter. We are watching a catastrophic failure of doctrine and leadership unfold in real time, and it has nothing to do with the courage of the sailors manning our fleets and everything to do with the incompetence of the political class in Washington that sent them into a kill box. The Strait of Hormuz is the jugular of the industrialized world. It is 21 miles wide at its narrowest point, but the shipping lanes are only 2 miles wide in either direction. To a military strategist looking at a map, this is not a sea lane, it is a coffin. For the last 30 years, the Pentagon has built a force structure designed for power projection, for steaming unopposed across the open oceans and launching aircraft to bomb adversaries who had no means of fighting back. We built a navy for bullying developed nations with no coastal defenses. We did not build a navy to survive in a saturation environment against an adversary who has spent 40 years preparing specifically for this moment. The Iranians are not going to meet us in the open water for a Mahanian naval duel. They are not stupid. They are going to fight a war of attrition from the land using geography as their primary weapon, and we are walking right into the trap. The concept of reciprocal security measures is a polite diplomatic way of saying they are going to apply an asymmetric cost to American arrogance that we cannot afford to pay. Let's look at the math, because warfare at its core is not about narratives or moral superiority. It is about cold, hard arithmetic and logistics. The United States Navy operates destroyers and cruisers equipped with the Aegis combat system. These are billion-dollar platforms carrying a finite number of interceptor missiles in their vertical launch systems. A standard Arleigh Burke-class destroyer might carry 90 or so missiles. In a high-intensity conflict where the IRGC unleashes a swarm of cheap, mass-produced suicide drones, anti-ship cruise missiles, and ballistic missiles, the math turns against us immediately. If Iran fires 100 cheap munitions at a single destroyer, and that destroyer fires its entire magazine to defend itself and achieves a 90% intercept rate, which is optimistic, 10 missiles still get through, those 10 missiles sink the ship. Even if the ship survives, it is now empty. It has to leave the fight to reload, which cannot be done at sea. It has to return to a port thousands of miles away. Meanwhile, the Iranians have thousands of missiles hidden in hardened tunnels all along the mountainous coastline. They can reload in an hour. We are trying to fight a math problem we cannot solve. We are trading $2 million interceptors for $50,000 drones. It is an economic defeat before the first sailor is even lost. This is the reality of attrition warfare that the West has forgotten. We have become obsessed with high-tech maneuver warfare, with quick, decisive victories that look good on CNN. But the enemy has a vote. Iran has looked at our capabilities, and they have decided to bypass our strengths and exploit our critical weakness, which is our inability to sustain casualties and our inability to sustain a high volume of fire over a prolonged period. The neoconservatives in Washington think they can just send a carrier strike group into the Persian Gulf, and the sheer sight of American flags will make Tehran back down. That is a fantasy. A carrier strike group in the confined waters of the Gulf is a sitting duck. It is a $13 billion target that cannot maneuver effectively and is within range of everything from shore-based artillery to swarming speedboats. If you put a carrier in there, you are not projecting power, you are offering a hostage. You are giving the IRGC the opportunity to humiliate the United States, claiming the destruction of a capital ship for the price of a few dozen missiles. The tragedy here is that this was entirely predictable. I and others have warned for years that our reliance on complex, fragile technology would be our undoing against a determined adversary fighting on their own turf. We have focused on building platforms that are expensive to build, expensive to maintain, and impossible to replace quickly. The Iranians have focused on volume, redundancy, and survivability. They have decentralized their command and control. They have buried their launchers deep underground. They have built a force designed to absorb punishment and keep firing. We have built a force that creates a brittle glass cannon. We can deliver a massive punch, but we cannot take one. And in the Strait of Hormuz, you are going to take punches. This reciprocal policy means that every American tanker, every container ship, every vessel carrying goods bound for U.S. ports is now a target. We cannot escort them all. The U.S. Navy simply does not have the hull numbers. We shrunk the fleet while expanding our commitments, and now the bill has come due. This failure is systemic. It stems from a Pentagon that is run by bureaucrats who are more interested in social engineering and defense contracts than in warfighting. They have spent the last 2 decades fighting goat herders in the mountains of Afghanistan, and they have deluded themselves into thinking that experience translates to a high intensity maritime conflict against a state power. It does not. The skills required to patrol a village in Kandahar are useless against a supersonic anti-ship missile skimming the waves at Mach 3. We have a generation of officers who have never faced a peer adversary, who have never had to look at a radar screen filled with hundreds of incoming contacts and realize that they are about to die because their government wrote a check. Their tactics couldn't cash. The political leadership has put them in this position. They have engaged in a campaign of maximum pressure against Iran without the military capacity to back it up if the bluff is called. Well, the bluff has been called. The operational trap is now set. By announcing this policy, Iran has placed the onus of escalation on Washington. If we do nothing, our economy suffers and our prestige collapses. If we intervene, we have to do it in the one place on Earth where we are at the greatest tactical disadvantage. To open the shipping lanes, we would have to conduct a massive air and amphibious campaign to clear the Iranian coast of missile batteries. We do not have the troops for that. We do not have the logistics for that. And the American public has no stomach for that. So we will likely choose the worst possible option, which is a halfway measure. We will send ships to patrol. We will shoot down a few drones. We will pretend we are in control until a missile gets lucky and a ship burns. Then the real war begins, a war we are not prepared to fight and cannot win on the terms we have set for ourselves. The trapdoor has swung open, and the generals in the Pentagon are marching us right through it, blindly following the orders of politicians who think war is a video game. This mentality is rooted in a fundamental doctrinal error that has plagued Western military thought since the end of the Cold War. We fell in love with the concept of maneuver warfare. We convinced ourselves that with enough technology, speed, and network-centric communication, we could dance around an enemy, paralyze their decision-making loops, and force them to surrender without us having to actually destroy their army. It is a doctrine born of hubris, and it relies on the assumption that you possess total information dominance and total air superiority. In the deserts of Iraq, against a demoralized conscript army cut off from its command structure that worked. But the Strait of Hormuz is not the desert, and the Iranians are not the Republican Guard of 1991. We are trying to apply a doctrine of movement in a battle space where movement is lethal. The ubiquity of intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance assets, specifically drones and commercial satellite imagery, means that the battlefield is now transparent. There is no such thing as surprise anymore. If you can be seen, you can be hit, and if you can be hit, you can be killed. The Western way of war has become an exercise in avoiding contact, whereas the Russian and Iranian way of war is centered on firepower and attrition. They understand something we have forgotten, which is that war is ultimately a contest of industrial output and destructive capacity. It is about throwing more high explosives downrange than the other guy can absorb. While we were building lighter, faster forces designed for expeditionary policing operations, our adversaries were studying the lessons of the First and Second World Wars. They know that when peer powers collide, maneuver stops, and the meat grinder begins. Look at the First World War. The generals in 1914 thought it would be a war of movement, a war of cavalry, charges, and quick, decisive battles. Within months, the reality of the machine gun and rapid-fire artillery forced them into the trenches. The technology of firepower had outpaced the technology of movement. We are in a similar moment now, but the generals in the Pentagon refuse to see it. The anti ship missile and the suicide drone are the machine guns of the 21st century. They deny access, they make movement impossible. Yet our entire naval doctrine is predicated on the idea that we can sail wherever we want, whenever we want. This is a catastrophic misreading of military history and physics. We are behaving like the French cavalry in 1914, wearing bright uniforms and charging into machine gun fire because our doctrine says that spirit and elan are superior to bullets. They are not. The Iranians have adopted a defensive fires complex similar to what the Russians have perfected in Eastern Europe. They don't need to defeat the U.S. Navy in a blue water engagement. They simply need to create a zone of death that we cannot enter without sustaining unacceptable losses. They have built a layered integrated air defense system and a coastal defense cruise missile network that overlaps. You destroy one radar, 10 more light up. You sink one fast attack craft, 5 more come out of the shadows of the coastline. It is a hydra. Western doctrine has no answer for this because Western doctrine assumes a short, sharp war. We do not have the industrial capacity or the logistical depth to fight a long war of attrition. If we lose 3 destroyers in the first week of fighting, that is a national trauma for the United States. For the Iranians, losing 1,000 drones is a Tuesday. We are structurally incapable of trading blows in this kind of fight. The reason we have arrived at this point of strategic incoherence is entirely due to the quality of people we have promoted to positions of power. I have said this repeatedly, and I will say it again. The United States government and the upper echelons of the military are populated by men and women with backgrounds in social science, law, and political theory. They do not understand the physical world. They do not understand logistics, ballistics, or industrial engineering. They view war as a legal argument or a public relations campaign. They think that if they can construct a compelling narrative about rules-based international order and send a sternly worded démarche, that reality will bend to their will. They are totally detached from the mechanics of violence. A lawyer looks at the Strait of Hormuz and sees a violation of international maritime law. A military realist looks at the Strait of Hormuz and sees a choke point saturated with sea mines and overlapping fields of fire. The lawyer thinks he can solve the problem with sanctions and coalitions. The realist knows you can only solve the problem with blood and iron, and right now we don't have enough of either. This lack of technical competence at the top filters down and corrupts the entire decision-making process. When you have a Secretary of State or a National Security Advisor who has never held a rifle, who has never seen a man die, and who thinks that diversity is a force multiplier, you are going to get disastrous policy. They treat the military like a toy. They deploy carrier strike groups as if they are moving chess pieces on a board, not realizing that a carrier is a floating city of 5,000 souls that requires massive amounts of fuel, food, and spare parts. They commit these forces to dangerous theaters without any clear objective or exit strategy because they think American power is magic. They believe our own propaganda. They actually believe that because we spend $800 billion a year on defense, we are invincible. They don't ask where that money goes. They don't ask why a bag of bushings for a fighter jet costs $90,000. They just look at the top line budget number and assume safety. This is the arrogance of the amateur. The professional knows that budget equals nothing if it doesn't translate into combat power. The Iranians have a defense budget that is a fraction of ours, yet they have achieved local superiority in the Gulf. How? Because they are serious. They are not spending their money on diversity, equity, and inclusion seminars. They are spending it on concrete, steel, and guidance chips. They are run by engineers and revolutionary zealots who understand that their survival depends on their ability to kill Americans. Meanwhile, we are run by people who are worried about carbon footprints in the military and making sure our lethal aid is gender neutral. It is a farce. But the consequences will not be funny. When the first missile impacts a U.S. frigate and the hull buckles and the fires start spreading, those policy papers written by Ivy League graduates won't put out the flames. The incompetence of the political class is the single greatest threat to American national security. They have hollowed out the institution, promoted sycophants who tell them what they want to hear, and marginalized anyone who dares to speak the truth about our actual readiness. We are walking into a buzzsaw led by people who think they are gardening. The disconnect between the political objectives in Washington and the military capabilities in the Persian Gulf is now absolute. Washington wants to dictate terms to Tehran. The military reality is that Tehran has a knife to the throat of the global economy, and we cannot remove it without bleeding out. We are seeing the collision of a fantasy based foreign policy with a physics based military reality. The doctrine of maneuver, which was supposed to be our silver bullet, has failed because it ignored the evolution of technology. We invested in platforms, they invested in counters, we bought the spear, they bought the shield and a shotgun. Now we are standing in the kill zone wondering why our expensive theories aren't working while the enemy is simply doing the math and waiting for us to make a move. The institutional rot goes much deeper than just the incompetence of a few political appointees. We are witnessing the total collapse of the Pentagon as a functional military organization and its replacement by a bloated corporate bureaucracy designed solely to transfer wealth from the American taxpayer to the defense contractors in Northern Virginia. The military industrial complex that President Eisenhower warned us about is no longer a threat, it is the governing reality. We do not have a Department of Defense, we have a Department of Procurement. The priority is not to build weapons that work on the battlefield. The priority is to build weapons that are expensive to develop, require endless maintenance contracts, and spread jobs across as many congressional districts as possible to ensure political protection. The result is a military equipped with gold-plated Frankenstein monsters that look impressive at air shows but fail catastrophically in combat. We have replaced effectiveness with profitability, and in war, the marketplace does not care about your quarterly earnings. It cares about whether your equipment kills the enemy or gets you killed. Look at the technological disparity that has emerged because of this corruption. For the last 30 years, while we were distracted with nation building and counterinsurgency, Russia and China were watching us. They saw how we rely entirely on air power and satellite communications. They realized they could not compete with us dollar for dollar, so they didn't try. They invested in asymmetry. The most glaring example of this failure is the Patriot air defense system. The Pentagon and the media tout it as the ultimate shield, the wonder weapon that can stop anything. The reality on the ground in Ukraine and the Middle East tells a very different story. The Patriot is a system designed in the 1,980 seconds. It is complex, fragile, and immobile. It requires a massive radar signature that acts as a beacon telling every enemy missile exactly where it is. We have seen it fail repeatedly to intercept primitive drones and cruise missiles. Yet we continue to build them and we continue to sell them to our allies because Raytheon needs the contracts. We are selling our friends a false sense of security. When an Iranian hypersonic missile or a mass drone swarm comes in, the Patriot radar will be overwhelmed and the interceptors will miss. We are betting our lives on a system that has a batting average that would get a minor league baseball player fired. Contrast this with what the Russians have achieved. While we were wasting trillions on the F-35, a flying computer that spends more time in the repair shop than in the air, the Russians were developing hypersonic missile technology. This is the single greatest strategic surprise since the atomic bomb, and the West has absolutely no answer for it. The Russians have the Kinzhal and the Zircon missiles capable of flying at Mach 9 or Mach 10, maneuvering unpredictably during flight. There is no air defense system in the Western arsenal, including the Aegis system on our destroyers, that can track and intercept a target moving that fast with that kind of maneuverability. A Zircon missile can tear a hole through an aircraft carrier before the captain even knows he is under attack. This is not science fiction. This is deployed technology. The Russians have it. The Chinese have it. We do not. We are years behind because our procurement system is too slow, too corrupt, and too risk-averse to innovate. We are still building subsonic cruise missiles that are easy targets for modern air defense, while our adversaries are fielding weapons that render our entire surface fleet obsolete. This technological gap is exacerbated by the collapse of our industrial base. We have deindustrialized the United States and outsourced our manufacturing capacity. We cannot produce basic munitions in the quantities required for high-intensity warfare. We are seeing this play out in real time with 155 millimeter artillery shells. Russia is producing nearly 3 million shells a year, running their factories 24 hours a day. The United States and all of NATO combined are struggling to produce a fraction of that. We have high-tech factories that can hand build a few exquisitely expensive missiles a month, but we have lost the capacity for mass production. We tore down the foundries and the steel mills and turned them into shopping malls and distribution centers for cheap imported plastic. You cannot fight a war with Amazon warehouses. You need steel. You need chemicals. You need engineers who know how to weld and cast metal, not just code software. The Russians understand that quantity has a quality all its own. We have forgotten it. We have a boutique military designed for punishment raids, not a war machine designed for survival. The corruption of the officer corps is the final nail in the coffin. In the U.S. military today, you do not get promoted to general by being a brilliant tactician or a warrior. You get promoted by being a good program manager, by keeping your mouth shut about the flaws in the equipment, and by parroting the political slogans of the day. The path to a third or fourth star involves managing a multi-billion-dollar acquisition program and making sure the money keeps flowing to the contractors. And what is the reward? When these generals retire, they don't go fishing. They walk right out of the Pentagon and onto the board of directors of Lockheed Martin or Boeing or General Dynamics. They cash in on the very programs they approved while they were in uniform. It is a legalized kickback scheme. This revolving door ensures that no general will ever stand up and say, "This tank is a death trap," or "This plane doesn't work," because doing so would threaten their future paycheck. They are selling out the safety of the soldiers, sailors, and Marines. They are sworn to lead for a seat at the corporate table. So we arrive at the Strait of Hormuz with a fleet that is undermanned, overextended, and reliant on defensive systems that cannot stop the threat. We are facing an adversary in Iran that has stockpiled thousands of missiles and drones specifically designed to overwhelm our defenses. They have learned from the Russians. They have shared technology. They are using rocket motors and guidance systems that are cheap, robust, and effective. They don't need to sink every ship. They just need to mission kill enough of them to break the political will of the United States. And they know that we cannot replace our losses. If we lose a carrier, it will take 10 years and $15 billion to build another one. If we lose a destroyer, it takes 3 years. We simply do not have the industrial elasticity to absorb attrition. The Iranians can build a suicide drone in a garage for $10,000. The asymmetry is terminal. The Pentagon has spent decades preparing for the wrong war with the wrong weapons led by the wrong people, and now reality is crashing through the door. The check engine light has been on for 20 years, and we just turned up the radio. Now the engine has exploded. We are now transitioning from the realm of tactical defeat to the realm of existential catastrophe. The incompetence I have described regarding our ships and our industrial base is bad enough, but where this road ultimately leads is the crossing of nuclear red lines that should never have been approached. The root of this current nightmare, the reason we face an adversary in Russia, and by extension their partners in Tehran, who possesses strategic weaponry we cannot counter, goes back to a single specific betrayal. In 2002, the George W. Bush administration, under the influence of the very same neoconservatives who are still running things today, unilaterally withdrew from the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty. That treaty was the cornerstone of global strategic stability. It operated on a grim but necessary logic. If neither side can build a shield against nuclear weapons, then neither side will dare to launch a first strike. It ensured mutually assured destruction. By walking away from it, Washington sent a clear message to Moscow. We intend to build a shield so we can use our sword without fear of retaliation. We declared that we wanted absolute dominance, not strategic balance. At the time, Vladimir Putin warned us. He said this was a mistake. He said it would force Russia to develop new asymmetric systems to penetrate any missile defense we could build. The arrogant fools in Washington laughed at him. They thought Russia was a gas station masquerading as a country, a broken power that would never rise again. They were wrong, dead wrong. Because of that withdrawal, Russia embarked on a crash course of research and development that has produced the most terrifying arsenal of strategic weapons the world has ever seen. We broke the treaty, and in doing so, we birthed the nightmares that now hold us hostage. We forced them to innovate, and they did. Look at what they have fielded while we were wasting money on failed regime change wars. They have the Avangard, a hypersonic glide vehicle that sits atop an ICBM and can maneuver at Mach 27. There is no physics-based defense against it. It renders our entire missile defense shield utterly useless. They have the Poseidon, a nuclear-powered unmanned underwater vehicle, essentially a gigantic torpedo with unlimited range that carries a massive cobalt-salted warhead. It is designed to detonate off a coastline and create a radioactive tsunami that would render the eastern seaboard of the United States uninhabitable for centuries. They have the Burovesnik, a nuclear-powered cruise missile with effectively infinite range that can circle the globe for days, waiting for the command to strike, bypassing every radar network we have. These are not weapons of war, they are weapons of Judgment Day. And they exist solely because we refuse to treat Russia as a great power with legitimate security interests. We pushed them into a corner and they came out swinging with a sledgehammer. The danger now is that this strategic tension is bleeding into conventional conflicts like the one developing in the Strait of Hormuz. This brings us to the terrifying ambiguity of the Tomahawk cruise missile. The Tomahawk is the workhorse of the U.S. Navy's strike capability. We use them for everything. But here's the problem. The Tomahawk is dual capable. It can carry a conventional high explosive warhead or it can carry a nuclear warhead. On a radar screen looking at the flight profile and the radar cross-section, a conventional Tomahawk looks exactly like a nuclear Tomahawk. There is no way for a Russian or Iranian radar operator to tell the difference until the mushroom cloud rises. This is the discrimination problem, and it is a recipe for accidental Armageddon. If the United States launches a salvo of Tomahawks against targets in Iran, or if we allow them to be used to strike deep into Russia, the leadership in Moscow has to assume the worst. Their doctrine is clear. If they detect an incoming mass missile strike that threatens the existence of the state or their strategic deterrent, they will not wait to see what kind of warheads explode. They will launch on warning. We are playing Russian roulette with a fully loaded automatic weapon. The Iranians know this. They know that they are now under the unspoken nuclear umbrella of the Russian Federation and China. They know that the United States is terrified of escalation because escalation leads to a level of violence that ends the American experiment. Washington is operating under the delusion that it can control the escalation ladder. They think they can have a limited war. They talk about tactical nuclear weapons as if they are just slightly larger artillery shells. This is insanity. There is no such thing as a limited nuclear war. Once the first nuke flies, the threshold is broken and the logic of use it or lose it takes over. The command and control systems break down, panic sets in, and the silos empty. The people advising the president, the blinkered ideologues who think they can manage warfare like a hedge fund, do not understand this. They have never stared into the abyss. They treat nuclear strategy like an academic exercise. But the Russians do not. They view nuclear weapons as the ultimate guarantee of their sovereignty, and they have been explicitly clear that any existential threat will be met with full force. The deployment of these new Russian systems has fundamentally altered the balance of power. The United States no longer enjoys the impunity it had in the 1,990 seconds. We can no longer dictate terms. In the Strait of Hormuz, the Iranians are emboldened not just by their own missiles, but by the knowledge that the global south and the Eurasian powers, Russia and China, have their back. They know that the U.S. cannot afford to get into a shooting war that might draw in Russia because we have no defense against the Zircon or the Poseidon. Our bluff has been stripped naked. We are standing there with a stick while the other side is holding a gun, and yet the rhetoric from the State Department remains belligerent. They are writing checks that our military cannot cash and that our survival cannot risk. We have betrayed the trust of the American people. We withdrew from treaties that kept us safe to pursue a fantasy of global domination, and instead we created a world where our cities are vulnerable to instantaneous destruction. The ABM withdrawal was the original sin. Now we are living with the consequences. Every time a U.S. destroyer sails through the Strait of Hormuz, every time we authorize a strike into Russian territory, we are rolling the dice on the survival of human civilization. The incompetence is no longer just frustrating, it is criminal. We are being led by sleepwalkers stumbling toward a cliff edge, and they are dragging the rest of us with them. The deterrent capability of the United States has been eroded not by foreign enemies, but by domestic hubris. We built a house of cards, and now the wind is blowing. This military defeat in the Strait of Hormuz and the strategic paralysis vis-a-vis Russia are merely the visible symptoms of a much deeper terminal illness. We are witnessing the accelerating political and economic collapse of the Western alliance structure. The so called rules based international order that Washington preaches about is revealed to be a hollow shell. It was easy to maintain that order when we were the only superpower and could bomb anyone who disagreed with us into submission. But now that the world has become multipolar, now that other nations have the industrial and military capacity to say no, the entire structure is crumbling. The sanctions regime, which was supposed to be our non kinetic nuclear weapon, has backfired spectacularly. We thought we could crush the Russian economy, and instead we destroyed the European economy. Look at our allies in Europe. They are the canaries in the coal mine. Germany, the industrial engine of the continent, is deindustrializing at a terrifying rate. They cut off cheap Russian energy to please their masters in Washington, and now their factories are closing, their chemical plants are shutting down, and their living standards are plummeting. The political instability in Europe is palpable. Governments are collapsing. Popularity ratings for leaders like Scholz and Macron are in the single digits, and the populace is waking up to the fact that they have been sacrificed on the altar of American geopolitical ambition. NATO is not stronger. It is a zombie alliance. It exists on paper, it holds summits, it issues press releases, but it has no combat power and no political cohesion. The moment the shooting starts in the Gulf or in Eastern Europe, NATO will fracture along national lines because no German or Frenchman wants to die for the Donbass or for the freedom of navigation of American oil tankers. Here at home, the situation is equally dire. We are $34 trillion in debt. We are borrowing money from China to build weapons to fight China. It is madness. The petrodollar system, which has allowed us to export inflation and print money without consequence for 50 years, is dying. The BRICS nations are trading in their own currencies. When the Saudis and the Iranians start trading oil in yuan instead of dollars, the American standard of living will collapse overnight. We will no longer be able to fund this sprawling global empire of bases and interventions. The bill is coming due, and we are broke. The Pentagon cannot pass an audit. They don't know where the money is. It is a massive money laundering operation disguised as a defense department. We are spending more on interest on the national debt than we are on defense, and yet the neocons continue to push for war on three fronts. The ultimate choice facing the American people, and whatever sane leadership remains, is stark and binary. We can continue on this path of delusion, denying reality, doubling down on failed policies, and stumbling into a catastrophic war that will end the United States as we know it. Or we can choose the path of reality. That means accepting that the unipolar moment is over. It means retreating from these unsustainable global commitments. It means closing the hundreds of bases overseas that serve no strategic purpose and bringing those troops home to defend our own borders, which remain wide open and undefended. It means firing the generals who have lost every war for the last 20 years. It means purging the State Department of the ideologues who think diplomacy is just screaming demands at sovereign nations. We need a total cleaning of the house. We need accountability. If a ship captain runs his vessel aground, he is relieved of command. Yet we have generals and politicians who have run the ship of state onto the rocks repeatedly, and they are given medals and promotions. This must end. The Iranian announcement regarding the Strait of Hormuz is a wake-up call. The world has changed. The technology has changed. The balance of power has shifted. We must adapt or we will perish. We need to stop trying to be the world's policeman and start being a serious functional republic again. The party is over, the lights are coming on, and the scene is ugly. But we have to look at it, we have to acknowledge it, and we have to fix it before the fires consuming the Middle East consume us all.